purpose of this talk is more of an introduction between two departments. I will cover a little bit of the research that my lab and my students have been doing. But for the first part of the slides, I want to introduce some of the types of research that we do in computational psychology and computational neuroscience. A lot of the things will be familiar to people in computer science. A lot of the techniques will be familiar, but some of the terms and some of our objectives are a little bit different. So I want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing before I give you some of the examples. A little bit of background in myself. I have a specialist degree in software engineering, and my PhD was both in computer science and cognitive psychology. So I do have a background in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and I do my best to try to fit those two disciplines together. So hopefully I have something interesting for this group here. This is the new vision modeling lab. Actually, most of these faces are from the previous NUG, but there's some carryover. We're still getting everyone pulled together. I'll give more information on the lab and contact for anybody that's interested in getting in touch with us. My research in general my topic is focused on eye movements and attention. These are two cognitive complex tasks within the brain, within psychology, and I use a number of different techniques and a number of different approaches to study those. Probably two of the main techniques that I use are eye tracking, because this is the best way that we can get a sense of where people are looking and where people are attending. But I also use computer models to try figure out the complexity behind this very complex system. Okay. I use tasks like visual search, different types of very directed eye tracking, gaze tasks, and so on. What I'm trying to do, here's the biological model of the visual system that we tend to work with. We've known a lot of the parts of this system for quite some time. It's a really nice one to study because we have, to a degree, it's an open system with very explicit input. We know exactly what the input into the system is. It's whatever's in front of the retina. And we do have a very measurable output, meaning eye movements to new areas of the scene. So it is a nice system that includes a lot of different other areas of the brain, and it's one of the few parts of the brain where we do have a very specific knowledge of the input. So we have that starting point at least. The group that I'm leading right now, we're trying to modularize and model that entire system. So we're taking the different pieces of that system apart. We have the early visual cortex that we're looking at that does the early visual feature processing of what comes in through the retina. We have later attentional areas, the frontal eye fields. We have the ocular motor areas that generate the eye movements. And we're taking each of those pieces separately, building smaller modules that try to simulate the way they work, and then piece it all back together for a full simulation of the visual system. So we've got a lot of different projects from a lot of students in the group. We have a couple of master's students here. We have a couple of students from computer science, some from psychology, some from neuroscience, all working on different pieces of this puzzle. So the talk is on computational cognitive neuroscience. I figure I'll spend a minute defining each of those terms for you. The computational part, I think nobody here has any trouble with. The point I'd like to highlight is that we do use a lot of similar techniques. In terms of the tools we use, I've been working with neural networks, deep learning neural networks, restricted Boltzmann machines, long short-term memory, reinforcement learning. Also, I do some Bayesian modeling, especially the temporal aspects, dynamic Bayesian networks. Classifiers, maybe not quite so much. I do some unsupervised clustering. Is anybody familiar with good old-fashioned AI as a term? This is the older 80s expert systems, cognitive architectures, and so on. Not so much in that area either. They've been falling out of date. But we do run the spectrum of the machine learning terms. Now, for the cognitive part, what we're interested in here is specifically larger scale functions of the way that the brain works. So attending, how do we choose what to focus on in our environment? Understanding, how do we reach cognitive understanding of situations that we're in? Perceiving, how do we interpret what we see? Remembering, how do we remember different aspects and where to be and when to be there? Some of the questions and some of the focus, there is an overlap in the computational and the psychology, the cognitive approach to these. The cognitive revolution in psychology sort of made a switch so that we treat the brain as an information processing system, similar to the way that computers work. Of course, we recognize that they do it in different ways, but we still treat it as an information processing problem. If you treat the brain as an information processing system, then you can bring a lot of these computational techniques to bear into solving those problems. Now the neuroscience part. There are some very useful and decent, purely computational cognitive algorithms without the neuroscience component. And they focus simply on the model of those cognitive processes alone. What I'm more interested in is computational cognitive neuroscience, where these models both are accurate to the biology of the brain in addition to the cognitive functions. So how do they connect some of the things that we know about the organization of the brain? So here's another more schematic map of the visual system that I just showed you. With our input from the retina going in through the lower visual areas, the attention system, and then down here towards the eye movement generation systems. So we have a very good understanding of the biology of the ocular motor system and the visual system now. So the challenge is to try get these models that are at least neurally plausible. They have some basis in the biology, but also give us more information that tell us a little bit more about how those cognitive functions work. Okay? So, trying to get all three of those to work together is not necessarily an easy problem, but it's a really fun area of research. Now, a little bit of definition on the term modeling, because this can be used in a lot of different ways as well. So one of the reasons why I like computational modeling, we have had a lot of attempts to build a better understanding of cognition and neuroscience before, but modeling forces us to be very, very precise with our terms. This is the computer scientist in me coming back out, where I enjoy that precision. It helps me define exactly what I want, and it forces me to be exact. So when somebody talks about attention and they say, well, we move our eyes to the focus of attention. Well, what do you mean the focus? Well, how do you define that? Precisely what do you mean by moves? What do you mean by attention? Computational models and mathematical models force us to be very, very explicit about what we mean about these terms. The best theories and models, I actually put these on the same level, a theory and a model, because I see a model as an instantiation of one of the current theories. Not all models are computer algorithms. In fact, we have had a lot of really good theoretical models over the years and over the decades. Any attempt to build a cohesive understanding of an aspect of a field is a theory, and they don't have to be computational. I just prefer the computational ones. And not all computer algorithms are models. Classifiers have been doing amazing things these days in terms of spam detection, in terms of image detection, classification of faces, and so on. But they're not necessarily models unless they tell us how those things work within cognitive psychology. So that's the overlap that I try to get to. You probably know these definitions. A theory is a tested, unifying explanation. A hypothesis is a suggested explanation for an observable portion of that theory. And an experiment is a controlled procedure to test out a hypothesis. Okay? How this fits together for me. Theories suggest hypotheses. Hypotheses are tested by experiments. Experiments' results are used to update the theory. The interesting part for me are computer models that adds to this by building that large-scale representation of the theory itself. Okay? And the data from the experiment, in addition to testing the theory, also helps us to train or test that model. Since most of my models tend to be machine learning or AI based, you guys know they require a lot of data. The experiments that we run in my lab and in my group, they feed into the computational models to help build and make them better. Okay? There are limitations of these models. We don't know for sure that you can model the brain with computers. Is the language of computing and the language of mathematics sufficient to model the brain? At the moment, we think so, at least to a decent degree. At the very least, we know that these models have substantially helped us understand the neuroscience and the psychology so far. And if it's useful enough to improve our understanding, that's certainly good enough for now. The other thing about models, they don't have to be as complex as the system you're looking at. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is by Newbert. The best model of a cat is another cat, or even better, the same cat. It was a joke. No? Okay. I just had to check. So the not so funny part of this, the lesson behind this is that if you expect your model to be of the exact same level of complexity as the thing you're modeling, you may not necessarily learn anything from it. If you simply duplicate what you're interested in, you're not going to learn about how it works. And the entire purpose of these models for me is how they work, what they tell us about how things work. That gives us an option of granularity. And this is where the trade-off, I see the trade-off between neural level models and cognitive level models. Cognitive level models tend to be very high-end, they tend to be very abstract. Neural level models tend to be very, very precise about a very specific group of neurons or a certain part of the brain. The best models tend to try to connect those two. And at any point, you have to choose your level of granularity. Do you want to go much more focused on a specific part of the brain? Then you lose your ability to explain a broader area of cognition. If you go for a higher level model that tries to explain a broad area, you may not be as close to those neural activations as you might be interested in. Brains are complex, models are complex. Many fields these days are switching over to models like meteorology if you want to understand how hurricanes are formed. You need a complex model to include all of the possible variables that will influence your system. Models of the universe, models of consciousness, these are all complex systems and we have to be able to treat them as such. For many years, we have been trying to reduce these problems to simpler and simpler aspects. Computational models allow us to treat them as complex systems again and try to bring everything back together. Another part of modeling that many people forget is the idea of falsifiability. We want models that can be falsified. If we produce a model that is always accurate regardless of what type of data we see, then it's not a very useful model. For example, if we make a prediction of an incredibly large, if there's an incredibly large possible range that our data could fall in, and still we can claim that it supports our model, then even if the data does fall within that range, we have to admit that it's weak support for that model. Same with data that is incredibly variable but still falls within that large area. This is still weak support. If we make very, very precise predictions, but the data is very variable, also weak support. What we're looking for are models that make very, very specific predictions and allows for the possibility that the results will not fall within the predicted area. They have to be falsifiable. Okay. These terms, you may treat them, you probably have heard of these in a probabilistic sense, generative versus discriminative. Most computer scientists think of it as a probability difference between the two. On a cognitive psychology side, I think of generative algorithms as those that are closer to a simulation than a description of the data. So many of the models that I'm trying to work on, we want to be able to test them in many different ways. One of the ways that we test them is get them to make responses in the same way that people do. If we're doing a model of the visual system, we can get a model that simulates eye movements in space or in time, and you'll see some data on that soon. And if the model generates the same types of responses, the same types of data that we're interested in, that's what I call a good generative model. Okay? It's another way of testing the algorithm. Discriminant models, however, are more descriptive, and these tend to be the more black box ones. I will be getting to some cool studies soon, I promise. The other thing that I tell my students, at least on the psychology side, is that we're not always worried about the state of the art. Back in the early days of AI and the early days of cognitive psychology, there was a lot more overlap between the two disciplines. Some of the biggest names in neural networks were actually psychologists. Donald Hebb, the people that started to first generate these ideas of connectionist learning. Since then, computer science and psychology have diverged quite a bit, and computer science have gone far beyond what we are currently using in computational modeling in terms of algorithms. We're starting to merge back in again. There's some interesting overlaps, but there's a lot of techniques, a lot of models, a lot of approaches that may seem a little bit old school for people in this department, but are still very, very useful in terms of modeling and understanding cognition from our perspective. So this is just a reminder, mostly from the psychology side, that we don't need the latest and greatest in order to improve our understanding. Is everybody familiar with this chart from Russell Norvig? He tried to describe a new approach. Actually, the name of the book was Artificial Intelligence, A New Approach. It's probably about 20 years old now, the first edition. And they were one of the first books to really look at the autonomous agent approach to AI. And the authors tried to divide the field of AI into what the goal actually is. You can have thinking or you can have acting, if you look at the different rows here. and you can have humanly or you can have rationally from the columns. And by looking at the cross sections of these, you get different approaches. Are you trying to build an AI that thinks the exact same way that humans do? This is what we now call artificial general intelligence. The people trying to actually simulate and build a computer level brain. There's not many people in that area, and most of us, I think most of us anyway, agree that this one is probably quite far away. There are a lot of people like Elon Musk and others that have been claiming that this is somewhat the goal of artificial intelligence these days and causing a lot of publicity and newspaper articles. But I don't think most of the research that we find in most computer science departments is anywhere near this idea or this approach. We have acting humanly, and this is mimicking human behavior without any care about whether the way that it's done is matching or not. A lot of the work I do is actually in this area, in the simulation, because I want to be able to simulate human behavior and try to understand human behavior by doing so. Most of the research, I think, in most of computer science is moved down here, acting rationally. This is your classifiers. These are your attempts to solve very, very real problems using the best technique regardless of whether it's the same way that a human does it or not. If your linear discriminant analysis solves the problem with the highest accuracy, if you have a Bayesian network or a neural network, regardless of how people do it, if your algorithm can do it better, then by all means choose that approach. It is the goal-driven approach to solving a very, very specific problem in a rational way. I would argue this is where most of our research is these days. So quite far from the artificial general intelligence. Okay, so that sort of gets you in the frame of mind to the way that I approach computation, to the way I'm approaching the problems that I'm interested in. Any questions on the approach before I get into the problems? Okay, everyone's hypnotized by the eye movements. I'll move on. I did this intentionally. Or I did it attentionally, depending on your perspective. So if the brain is an information processing system, you have to have some sort of mechanism for deciding which information is relevant and which information is irrelevant. Many times you'll have too much information coming in to process at any given moment. Which information do you use? Which information do you dismiss? What will you focus on and what will you ignore? For humans, this is called the attention system. And for spatial attention, for visual spatial attention, the way that we process the visual world, this is actually closely tied to the eye movement system. We move our eyes, you can probably see here, this is actual recording of a participant moving their eyes in a visual search task. We move our eyes in this ballistic manner called saccades, probably 2 or 3 times every single second, but we don't notice it. It's our visual system is set up to smooth over all of these jumps and ballistic movements. So, given that there's an overlap between eye movements and attention, eye movements are a wonderful measure of the attention system. So I use eye movements a lot. We have very high-speed eye trackers. We have a couple of great systems that we use to infer what people are attending at any given time. Now, I'm going to go for a little bit of a history lesson, and I'm going to talk about somebody else's algorithm, just because this is such a classic algorithm in the visual world, in the visual system. And it has some really great examples of that combination of computation, neuroscience, and cognitive approach that I was talking about. Okay? And it's an Idionkach model of salience. Has anyone seen this model before? Maybe some of the people from psychology? Okay. So this is one of the most influential models of the last 20 years, and it's getting close to its 20-year anniversary. The fact that it is so old and still in use and still sort of the golden standard of this approach really tells its strength and its ability to inform us about what's going on in the visual system. I'm mapping this, this is the schematic of the model itself, and just to remind you of the schematic of the visual system, the model goes from input, where it has a pixel level image. You get the raw image on the input, and this is analogous to a retinal image that we get through the retina as we move our eyes. On the output, we have eye movements. We have shifts of attention to different locations in that image, and they happen over time as well. So the same type of processing that we have here, we have through here, okay? And it makes a really good mapping onto the two. Why is this so good? Well, it's grounded in theory. All of our best cognitive theory has gone into this model. It's neurally plausible, and it makes very testable predictions. There's been many attempts to improve this model, and there's been a lot of improvements on this model over the years, but not many challenges to it. They have been adding to it and improving it rather than replacing it. It starts off with pixel level coordinates that we assume to be retinal coordinates as well. The very early areas of the visual processing is pretty much a two-dimensional map of your retinal input. So we can think of that image as the image that falls on the retina. A lot of what I'm talking about is a simplification, but it'll, like we said, the best model of a cat is a cat. So simplifications are okay here. Like any model, those of you in computer science know data pre-processing is essential and a pain. One of the greatest things about this model is that they included that data processing as part of the model itself. Okay? So one of the first stages of that pre-processing uses these dyadic Gaussian pyramids. They take the original image and first put it through a low-pass filter. Some of you may recognize some of the techniques here. So if anybody has been doing computer vision since before deep learning neural nets came in, you'll probably recognize some of these techniques. This is the way that it used to be done before neural nets took over. So the first thing is a low-pass filter. You do a blurring filter on top of the overall image, and then you would do a downsampling to keep every nth pixel or so on. Blur, downsample, blur, downsample, blur, downsample. And what you end up with is this dyadic Gaussian pyramid where any pixel on the higher level is an average, it's a blurred average of a group of pixels beneath, okay? You're building this pyramid as this collection of reduced subsampling and blur. This can be done in parallel, of course. The great thing about this approach is that we actually have neurons in the early visual system called center surround neurons. And these differ depending on whether they get signal on the surround part of the neuron or the center part of the neuron. And based on how they fall, when you individually, these neurons aren't that interesting. They can only detect dots. But if you line them up and have enough of them close to an edge of a visual scene, so the edge along here, the edge along here, they actually function wonderfully as edge detection when you group these neurons together. So this dyadic pyramid actually functions very similar to these center-surround neurons. Up here, at a higher level, what do you think? With this blurred average, is that a center or a surround part of a neuron? Any guesses? Who thinks center? Who thinks surround? It's actually surround. And the first time I taught through this algorithm, I got it backwards as well. It sort of makes sense that the smaller pixel would be the center, but it's actually the reverse. Because if you think about a single pixel value here, the one up here is actually representing 4, 8, or 16 pixels down below, isn't it? So a single pixel here, if you move up 1, that actually represents an average of the 16 pixels surrounding it. So the higher you go, the more surround it is. The lower you go, then you have the center. Okay? So if I combine this pixel with this pixel, I'm getting the difference between the center and the surround. And the algorithm, the Idien-Koch algorithm, does 8 levels of this, and they compare the difference between the second, third, or fourth as the center, and then whatever that center value is, plus either 3 or 4 levels as the surround. Okay? And you can do this at multiple levels. And that's why that gives an extra little bit of strength, because it's a multi-level pyramidal. Now, you can take those types of neurons and apply it to different types of data in that image. Here's where theory comes back in, cognitive theory. We have a wonderful, very strong, well-established theory in cognitive psychology called feature integration theory. And this was Treisman back in the 1980s. And she told us that the visual information is parsed separately to start with. The visual system extracts features from the visual stream and processes those features individually first, pre-attentively. Then we use attention to merge those features together. Sounds great. Here's a theory that we can use to do something similar with our algorithm. So let's take a couple of different features of the visual stream, process them separately before we merge them back together again. Intensity, basically the luminance, the brightness of the image. We can take that as the average of the RGB values. We can take the color information, and we can take orientation and edge information. These are different types of features that the visual stream processes, so let's do the same with our model. Intensity is easy. We grab the RGB values, we make 6 different maps based on 6 different combinations of those center and surround. This allows us to have focus on very small center surround luminance areas, or larger areas for the higher levels of that pyramid. Okay? Color, they went a little bit more back to the neuroscience for this one as well. We don't process RGB in the visual system. We actually have a color opponent system in the visual system. And so we tend to have neurons that process pairs of colors. They simulate, this is again a very crude abstraction of that color opponent system, but it still tries to match it, at least to some degree. What they did with this algorithm was implement 2 different types of color pairs. They looked at green-red pairs and blue-yellow pairs. 4 different combinations, so green-red, red-green, blue-yellow, yellow-blue. And again, one of them being the center, one of them being the surround. And we end up with 12 different maps based on 3 different levels of those 4 combinations. Okay? Orientation, they use Gabor filters for this one, the same way that you would do edge detection in any computer vision algorithm. So they did borrow a lot from the computational areas. They had Gabor filters at these 4 different angles, and again, 6 different combinations based on center and surround for 24 maps. So we have intensity information, we have color information, and we have edge information, all being processed in parallel through this algorithm. This is to get the multiple levels. Remember, we have 8 different levels of the pyramid. If we have a very high level for the surround and a very low level, imagine the 8th level of surround and the very first level of center. That's a very, very, very tiny center and a very, very large surround, basically the entire image. That would allow you to pick up little tiny dots of light that are different from the entire image. The closer you get, either the bigger the center or the smaller the surround. It allows you to focus, it allows you to pick up bright spots of different sizes compared to its surrounding. Probably trial and error. You can imagine that the 1st and 8th level center surround is probably not going to be that useful, because it would basically allow you to pick up a single pixel difference from the entire map. That's not something that the visual system would do. So 1 and 8 is too much. They probably played around with it and found that those 6 levels are usually sufficient. Okay. So we have these 3 different pathways. We have these, what do we have, 36, 42 different maps. How do we throw them together? Do we simply merge them? I'll give you a potential problem here. Can you describe the most salient thing in this image? What's the thing that pops out? Yep. It's that little white stripe here that's going down on an angle. There's a little bit of noise there. There's some white dots. But that white stripe is definitely the most salient thing. Now what's the most salient thing on the image? Is it the same one? Is it that white stripe? No, it's this one, isn't it? This is, I think that's part of the, that might be a fly or something. But yeah, thank you. So even though this hasn't changed at all, the visual input is exactly the same, but suddenly something else is more salient. So salience is relative. We can't use an absolute merging or mushing together because it depends on what is around it and what's in the other channels. If I make one of these red, then suddenly the red line is going to be the most salient thing. So not only can the location of the most salient thing change, the channel can change. We've switched from a luminance salience to a color salience. We've switched from an angle edge salience to a location salience, okay? And the way that the algorithm is going to see this, basically we have the intensity map, and because we're looking, this is what we will end up with after all of those dyadic pyramids, we're going to have some huge spikes on that partial map from the intensity. And we're going to have a lot of them. This is very salient. This is very salient if you just think about intensity. So is this, so is this. And that's represented by this spatial, all of these spikes on the spatial map. The orientation itself isn't that salient. This one is certainly the most salient thing, but just by orientation alone, it's not that different from the others, so it's not going to stand out a lot. If we just do a straight merge of these two, this most salient location is going to be drowned out by these spikes, isn't it? Remember I said that good models make predictions? If we do this merging as it is, we would make the prediction that combining all 42 maps, strong features in one map would outweigh and override weaker features in other maps. That's something we can test. We can bring subjects into our little experiments and we can see if that's actually the case. And it isn't. We just had a little mini experiment here. But still, it makes predictions that we can test. What we do is look for some sort of normality operator. And this is what the algorithm does. You get a global multiplier of the map of the overall. You get the difference of the current maximum versus the average maximum within that map. So for this intensity map, there's a lot of very high peaks, but the difference between those peaks is very minimal. So the difference between any given peak and the average peak is going to be quite low. So this term here is actually going to reduce these for the m minus m. They're going to be similar values. That's going to reduce it. This one, however, this peak compared to the average peak is actually much larger. So this normalization will serve to increase this orientation map. And after the normalization process, we'll end up with something like this. Now we can merge them together.
Is there a name for this normalization?
There might be in the paper. I don't recall it. It's usually just a normalization process, but it's very useful in many, many types of algorithms. So, yeah. I'm sure if you simply quote the paper, most people will know what you're talking about. So we do this, we get the individual maps first, we merge within a feature first, because feature integration theory tells us that's the way it works. Then we merge the different maps together, and we end up with a final saliency map itself. So given this image, we have the this piece here that's somewhat salient. The color will come up here. We have a little bit of white. Is that color? No, I think we have them in a different order. And then we have edges here. When we combine all of them, we end up with this map where the salient locations, this sign, and a little bit of the edge of the road here become very salient locations. Okay? Now, that just gives us spatial predictions. This map is model is a full implementation of the ocular motor system. So what we do, we don't just attend to different locations, we shift our attention to different locations over time. And the way they implement that is with a winner-take-all algorithm based on a leaky integrate and fire neural net. Let's take, we'll talk about leaky integrate and fire in a little bit. But what the algorithm does, it shifts attention starting with the most likely. So it chooses the most salient location. Then it inhibits that area using, again, based on our current theoretical understanding, inhibition of return. That inhibits that location for later inspection. Then we move to the next salient location. That one is inhibited. Next location, that one's inhibited. And we move our attention through space over time to these different salient locations. So overall, very cool model. And it works quite well with noisy algorithms, noisy backgrounds. You can add noise to any of these, and it still does a lot better than basic feature detection algorithms. So why do we still discuss this? Because it tells us, it gives us a really good model of how the visual system works. It makes very specific predictions, and it makes experimental hypotheses that we can test. Okay? Those of you that are interested in this type of model, if you're interested in going a little bit farther with that. Like I said, I gave you the basic version of the model. There's a lot of improvements to this model over the years. You can find a lot of them in this review article, State of the Art in Visual Attention Modeling, Bori and Iddy, 2014. There's more work since then, but this is probably a really good place to start. Problems with it, there's no top-down attention, so we don't, if I give you an image on the screen, everybody in this room is not going to move their eyes to the exact same locations at the exact same time. There's a lot of differences, there's what task you're asked to perform, and so on. So that gives you a basis of some of what we're doing. The work we've been doing over the past 3 to 5 years or so has been taking pieces of this algorithm and giving them an upgrade. Trying to figure out where the weaknesses are, turning it into more of a modular system. So the Iddy and Koch algorithm was sort of a pure linear front-to-back visual processing system. We're chopping it into smaller pieces, replacing individual pieces with more state-of-the-art systems, and but still trying to keep them as neurally plausible and cognitively informative as we can. One example. There is other information that we can look at other than those 3 simple features. There is task information, there's semantic information. If you're looking at this screen and you're hungry, your eyes are probably going to go through here. If you're looking at this screen and you're really interested in computational models, you might be looking at some of the references that we're doing. If you're really bored, you might be looking out the window. So your current attentional state, your goals, your tasks, all of those things also influence what you're doing. We've got a couple of cool projects by students, including some from here. Georgi, master's students here last year, Zoya and Katya from our program. They've been looking at semantic information augmenting this model. So what we did on that was take a look at, if you're looking for something in particular, you'll probably spend more time looking at similar things than dissimilar things, right? If you're looking for food, you're probably going to look at tables, you're going to look at plates, you're going to look at forks. You're not going to look at speakers. There's not much food up there at the speaker. So, and that's because the table, the fork, the plate have a higher degree of semantic similarity to the food that you're looking for. How do we get semantic information from an image? Well, we can, algorithms can't. We cheated a little bit. There's this great data set called the Label Me data set that's available online, and people have gone through and drawn lines around all of the major objects and have labeled them with XML files for exactly what those objects are. So it's a fully labeled image data set. There's a person, there's a tree, all of that information is in there. Has anybody played around with latent semantic analysis or LDA, latent Dirichlet allocation? These are machine learning algorithms. The LDA is a Bayesian approach. LSA is a more of a discriminant approach, probably closer to a matrix-based system. But what they do is they try to learn semantic information based on observable data. Typically, people use them for text. So you feed it large amounts of text, you feed it Wikipedia, you give it books, and it creates these models of similarity based on how often words co-occur. So if dog and cat occur in the same text or in the same paragraph or in the same line a lot, that means that they have a high degree of semantic similarity. If speaker and banana don't occur very often together, that means they have a low degree of semantic similarity. We can do the same with images. If person and tree occur in the same image a lot, they have a high degree of semantic similarity. If car and tire occur in the same image frequently. They have a high degree of semantic similarity. So we trained these semantic algorithms on these label me image data set, and that gave us a similarity score of objects. So if we get people to look at an image with a specific task, look for food, look for a cup, look for a picture, we can now say every pixel on that screen, based on whether it's within those objects or not, how similar that object is, that pixel is, to the focus of their search. That gives us a fourth map, a fourth feature. So all three of these students, they're working on, they were three different projects that they're now merging together, and hopefully will become a paper pretty soon. We've got some pretty cool results on this that allow us to add that fourth map of semantic similarity to the three maps that IDI and Koch already have. And we were able to improve the prediction based on that semantic information. So that's one project that we have that augments that with new information. There's other information that people have tried to use. We haven't added these to the maps yet, but I think one of the ones that we will be working on soon is this temporal information. And this is going to be one of the harder problems in the next coming 5 to 10 years for these images. If you're looking at this scene here, someone's basically making a sandwich, right? You know that something is going to be put here. This little spot here. There's going to be some tomatoes there, there's going to be some bacon. Something is going to end up on that bread. That's the process of sandwiches. All of you know that. This guy here knows that. The computer doesn't know that. There's semantic information that isn't even available in this image because it's temporal information.
Maybe you should feed like videos.
Some people are working on this problem with videos, yeah. That adds a level of complexity, and I haven't seen anybody solve it yet using videos. But temporal information is definitely the way to go on this, yeah. Because you are able to predict what will be salient in the future. And there's some great visual search studies that tell us that, that's a cool song, that tell us that people do look at places that will be salient in the future that are not salient now. So we know from experimental data that people do look at that blank slice of bread, even though none of the algorithms that we have to date predict it as a salient location. Is there a clock in the room? Will somebody give me like a 10-minute warning if we're starting to run out of time? I haven't given a long talk in some time.
We'll have 20 minutes.
Okay, good enough. So leaky integrating fire, I mentioned, was one of the was the key part of the algorithm that makes temporal predictions at the moment. We've been doing some work using leaky integrating fire, but not adding it to our algorithms, but showing why it shouldn't be a part of these algorithms. This is a wonderful neural level model that mimics how neurons accumulate information, spike and fire based on input. And we can look at EEG data, we can look at single cell recording, and all of these models do a beautiful job of predicting how neurons gather information and fire based on input. There's been a movement over the past, actually ever since this algorithm, to use these leaky integrating fire algorithms to try make behavioral predictions as well. So given that they accumulate information and predict temporal firing rates, they tried to use these and adapt them to predict eye movement responses. So the classic Adhd and Koch algorithm uses this leaky integrating fire layer to predict when people will move their eyes and shift their attention to these different locations. There's a lot going for them. They use lateral inhibition, which we know is important. Things that are, if I have a salient location here, not only does it attract attention, not only does it increase the firing rate, but it reduces the firing for adjacent locations. That's lateral inhibition. So it does all of these things that we know work at a neural level. But what about behavioral? It has all of these parameters. These are the parameters that we can set up to learn. Basically, you're predicting a voltage at any given time, and the voltage increases based on input from a given pixel value, from a given retinal value. We have our great formula here for testing the change in voltage over time. But when we compare it to human level eye movements, shifts of attention in real space, they fall a little bit short. And most people have only been looking at this algorithm in terms of spatial predictions. Does it predict where we move our eyes? We've actually been looking on, does it predict when you move your eyes? Because people move their eyes in very predictable ways, temporally. This blue graph here is very typical of human reaction times, both for button presses, for saccadic responses. Anytime you ask a person to make a speeded response to anything, you end up with sort of this log normal skewed distribution where you have a peak and then a longer skewed tail towards the end. These in particular are for reaction times in visual search. We're measuring the time that it takes for people to move their eyes in each of those ballistic jumps that we showed earlier on. The default parameters for the leaky integrating fire that people have been using for 2 decades don't match this data at all. So we've been making assumptions about this temporal pattern that really are not justified. We tried a couple of different maximization algorithms to try optimize those parameters to fit this. Just to let you know, we typically use a Kolmogorov-Smirnov statistic to maximize these. So whenever we do need a fitness function for our machine learning algorithm, we're trying to match this with Kolmogorov-Smirnov. And it usually works quite well. But even still with this, we managed to get a partial match, but it's bimodal. It doesn't quite fit the tail end very well. And it's not a very good fit. The other thing we noticed is that you have to feed a number of different images for this as well. This entire distribution is, the variance in this distribution is caused by the variance of the input images. If you look at the variance in just a single image, if we ask that leaky integrating fire to make eye movement responses to a single image over and over and over again, we end up with a much, much worse distribution. So it really doesn't have a lot of variability in the firing rate itself. It borrows the variance from the image. But of course, people have this distribution even if you give them the same image over and over and over again. So this is one thing that we're just submitted from another group, and we're basically pointing out the limitations of these algorithms in terms of human data. Remember, it's important to make falsification as well. That's what we need here. A better version of this is called the drift diffusion model. This has been, there's a couple of different types of diffusion models, and they may not be as neurally focused as the leaky integrating fire, but they do match the way that we accumulate information in a lot of different visual areas. So this is one of my favorite models, so I wanted to spend a few minutes looking at this one. It's a drift diffusion process, so we have a starting point where we're accumulating information ready to make a response. We have either 1 or even 2 different thresholds. If it's a choice response, you can either choose A or B, hit the right button or the left button, look up or look down. You can have a couple of different thresholds. And as soon as your accumulation reaches that threshold, a response is made. So in this one here, we have a response made at this time. Over here, we have a response made at this time. Here, we have a response made in the opposite direction at this time. We run this model many, many, many times, and we get a nice little distribution. Okay? The same as the distribution we get from our human subjects. The parameters of the model we can change to get different distributions as well. Let me show you the parameters in particular. So we have a starting point, we have a threshold, and we're accumulating information from that starting point to the threshold. We have a drift rate. This is the signal parameter that tells us it is a constantly moving towards the correct location. This is the signal in the system. So if I snap my fingers over here, I will look in this direction. The loudness of the signal would be reflected in the drift rate. Okay. There's also noise in the system. There is the standard deviation around that drift rate that adds an amount of variability over time as well. So time is going along here. The amount of signal is on the y-axis. Notice that the noise could move it in the incorrect direction for some amount of time, but the drift rate always goes towards the correct direction. And based on multiple iterations of this, you end up with a response distribution. You can have a bias. You can start this higher or lower towards different features as well. And there's non-decision components that you can add in for a constant factor. Ratcliffe is probably the biggest name in these drift diffusion models. He's been using them for many, many tasks over the years. Remember how bad the fit was on the distribution for the leaky and degrading fire? Believe it or not, there's two different distributions in each of these maps. One for the model fit and one for the human fit. So the human fit is in blue and the model fit is in rose or pink. And these are both manual reaction time tasks and eye movement, saccadic reaction time tasks. And it's able to model these. It always amazes me how accurate these model the response distributions whenever I do these. And not only that, we can use which parameters change to learn about the underlying cognitive factors. So if I have something like an experiment where I manipulate space to draw your attention somewhere or not, I can take a look at what parameter changes to get that best fit in those two experimental conditions. And I get a very, very different distribution based on which parameter it is. You know speed accuracy trade-offs, right? We can model speed accuracy trade-offs with drift and bias. That bias starting point will end up with a speed accuracy trade-off. You'll get faster, but it'll produce more errors. The drift rate will improve both your accuracy and your speed. So it really does help us get to the bottom of those underlying processes. The latest project, we just presented this at a conference in Italy, was to replace that leaky and degrading fire. So use that original Idienkoch model for the spatial prediction, but switch over to this better temporal prediction in that task that I just mentioned, drawing someone's attention to a location in space. So if we have these two markers on the screen that are roughly the same luminance values, then at some point I brighten one of them. I draw your attention to that location. Remember the model we just saw? If you have a luminance change, a very bright spot appearing on the screen, it'll attract your attention. And so it does here. Then we produce a target on the screen that they have to make a speeded response to. If it's in the same location as the spot that we drew their attention to, they should be faster. If it's in a different spot, they should be slower. This is one of the classic attention manipulations that we've used in these experiments. So we modeled this with the diffusion model, and we ended up with, we took a look at 3 different parameters that we could change. We looked at a speed accuracy trade-off, we looked at anticipations, and we looked at pure performance gains. And what we're finding is that it's the prediction made by this speeded attention pure performance gain is the best model fit based on this full process. So we're mimicking the full visual system, how it processes the spatial information and the temporal information. Okay. I'll flip through a couple of, this is one that people here might be interested in. It's the MIT Salience benchmark. What I just showed you was replacing the temporal component. We've also have 3 or 4 different groups replacing the spatial prediction. And like many of you have guessed, we're using deep learning neural networks to improve the spatial prediction on those. We have one student looking at deep nested autoencoders. So we have a deep autoencoder with a softmax layer representing the salience map at the end. We use a combination of supervised and unsupervised learning to generate this salience map. So far we've managed to match the Idiot prediction for spatial prediction, but we're looking at improving that more, maybe even with a convolution network. There's the stacked autoencoder results. So our best prediction is up around 0.7 on this curve. Some of them are as bad as chance. Georgi was a student here last year. He's still in the lab working on this generative adversarial networks. So this is a way where you can get a predictive network working with a discriminative network where one makes a prediction and the other gives it feedback as to how accurate that prediction was. And that allows us to give it an input of something like this image and learn based on that input the output salience map. We're not the first ones to do this. There is SalGAN 2017 that's already been playing around with this. They have a head start, but I think we're making some progress here, catching up to them. So that's another technique that we're approaching on this. One final point that I'll make about deep learning neural networks: they are incredibly accurate. They make great classifiers. They're solving a lot of problems. They're setting new benchmarks on a lot of different areas. But they may have limitations in terms of cognitive models. A little quiz to make sure everyone's still awake. Is this a bus or an ostrich? Bus. Okay, good. Everyone's still with me. What about this one? Is it a bus or an ostrich? Still a bus. Yep. Okay. Everybody here, nobody here had a real problem with that, right? Well, okay. Most didn't have a problem with that. Deep learning neural networks would have. Google just published this new technique for adding a mask to images that people basically can't see. We have no problem with this task even after those images have been manipulated by this mask. You still see this as some sort of pyramid. You still see a dog. You still see a bus, both before and after this mask. But every deep learning neural network that they tested, before they would get it correct, after this mask, they always see ostrich. So there are ways to fool. I know this is proof of concept, but there are ways to fool these deep learning neural networks into making mistakes that people would not make. This is proof of concept that even though they may have the same accuracy as people, they still do it in a fundamentally different way than people perceive these images. So if we want to take these deep learning neural networks and start using them as models of the human visual system, we have to be careful for things like this. And we have to take these tests to show that these assumptions are correct. One other example of mistakes that are made. This is another project by a student of mine, just finished up. We've got two inverted faces here. They look pretty normal. They look okay? No? Uh-huh. It becomes a little bit more apparent when you turn it upside down. When we invert faces, humans are actually inordinately impacted by that inversion. We process faces globally. This is our best current theory. And because we process them globally, we're more used to that processing for upright, normal faces. When you invert them, it changes the way that we process those faces. So you can invert a house, a computer, anything, and it doesn't impact you that much. You can still recognize it without too much difficulty. But faces, it hits a little bit harder than others. So we use this task to compare faces and houses. Our human participants ended up with a really nice face inversion effect. They were much more accurate for the regular faces than the inverted, but they weren't impacted by inverting houses that much. And that's for two different experiments. Deep learning neural networks, however, based on AlexNet, the CNN, actually ended up with a house inversion effect. So once again, it was able to do the task. It was able to recognize similar and dissimilar houses and faces, but the end result was that they do it a little bit differently. The processing that they do does not quite match the way that people do it. Okay? We were able on one example to generate a face inversion effect, but it was pretty much by having a floor effect at chance for houses. That was pretty much the only reason why we were able to do it. For the majority of our training iterations, it wasn't able to match the way that humans process faces and houses. So we've got a few other algorithms. I'd be happy to send around the slides to anybody that's interested. I do want to mention a little bit of advertisement. I know that our departments have been talking a lot about new collaborations between psychology, neuroscience, and computer science. So I'd like to extend a welcome and an invitation to anyone that is interested. We have lab positions if anybody wants to come over and be a research assistant in the lab. We've got lots of really cool interdisciplinary projects. I'm happy to supervise computer science projects if that's what you're interested in, either at the undergraduate group level or the master's individual level. There's a new internship program at the university where people visit labs at short-term basis to sort of give you a sampling of a lot of different labs. I'm happy for people to come over for that as well. And also more than willing to start up collaborations with anyone in the department that's working on similar material. Thank you. This is my new favorite quote. It's a Russian filmmaker, but it really hits what the approach that I make for vision simulation.
Other questions?
Can you come back one slide?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
No problem. I tried to give a bit of a sampling of the different projects that I have on the go that might be of interest to students here, but I'm happy to talk about any others as well.
How to get to this internship?
We're still figuring out the paperwork on that. It is brand new. Basically, if you contact me, we'll find out. We'll find out for you. I think it's just a simple form where they're unpaid positions, but it does give you some sort of, I don't know what exactly it gives. Experience, yeah. And I think the way that labs have typically worked in Russia is that it's a lifelong commitment signed in blood. You're never allowed to leave ever again. And that these internships are an attempt to try to change that a little bit, where you can go in and get a little bit of a taste of how one research goes and then move on and try something else. So, yeah, no problem.
So for all of your experiments, do you use commercially produced equipment, like all the side tracking stuff? And so
We have access to a couple of eye trackers. The Center for Decision Making and the Neurolinguistic Lab currently have 2 high-speed eye trackers that they generously share with us. We will be getting our own eye tracker, hopefully December-ish. But in the meantime, we do have access to some really, really high-quality equipment.
I was just wondering whether you do any kind of engineering kind of stuff, not only on the software part, but on the hardware part as well?
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk about this yet, but one of my former students wants to build an eye tracker. And he's in the process of making that happen. I would definitely be interested in more projects along that line as well. I saw a great talk at the conference that I was just at, the European Conference of Vision and Perception. And one person presented a classifier with gigabytes of input from visual search, just low-level eye movement properties. And what they did, they trained a classifier for the 3 different types of eye movements. Fixations, which are periods of relative visual stability, saccades, which are ballistic movements, and smooth pursuit, where you follow something slowly. And that's actually still a hard problem. So a classifier for being able to extrapolate that information from data sets is an engineering problem that would be a very cool mini project, for example. Okay. I also have an antique eye tracker. It's about 20 years old. It's one of these head-mounted systems. And if you're more of a hardware person, if you wanted to play around with this antique to try to get it up and running, that might be an interesting thing as well.
People should make more games with eye trackers.
There are possibilities there. We have one brand new experiment we call Space Invaders. And some of our experiments are really, really boring. You look at the screen, press a button. Look at the screen, press a button. Look at the screen. And we have people falling asleep after about 40 minutes of this. So we turned one of these classic attention tasks into a Space Invaders game. It's not hooked up to eye tracking yet, but if creative people want to try to gamify some of the experiments that we have to make them a little bit more interesting, that sounds really cool. This one might be a really good Java project where we could load it up online. One of our biggest problems is getting enough data. We're combining experimental psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning. So we need data. We always need more data. And if we can put up an experiment online, like a little Java applet or something like that to collect data for us, that would be amazing.
How about HX front cameras on telephones?
How about what, sorry?
HX front cameras.
That's another one. I'm not sure if we can get much eye tracking information from that. Both the temporal and spatial quality is probably a little bit too low. In terms of just a basic attention task, there might be something there. I know people have been looking into that, but I'm not quite up on the literature there.
Strange question. Did you have any experiments
The ADHD and eye tracking, I've been involved in a collaboration with that back in Canada. I haven't done anything on it in quite some time. It does, I think there's probably some technical issues to solve there first, because the participants tend to be very hard to calibrate in the first place. You have to go through a calibration process to train the system for the individual differences of each person's eye movements before you run the experiment. And people with ADHD tend to have very reflexive eye movements, and it's hard to calibrate them. So that is my biggest memory from that particular project. I don't know of anything on color blindness. We just did a study on Russian color naming, where we were looking at the two different names for Russian blue, Siny and Goluboy, which we don't have in English. And there's been a long-standing theory based on the Whorfian hypothesis that this produces a different way of thinking, and that there's a natural boundary between those color for Russian speakers that doesn't exist for English speakers. Not true. Hate to say it, but it's not true. So that's one paper that we're just getting ready now. So I do some color collaborations. I don't have anything currently on the go specifically for colorblind people. It might be interesting, for example, one of these models to see what happens to the other feature streams, let's say in the Idiot-Koch model, for people with color blindness. How do does the merging of those different features, how does it shift the weighting from those features when color blindness exists?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.